Who's kicking this off? Me?
You want to do the intro?
Welcome to the Planning Board Resiliency Code Workshop Part 2.
Perfect. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the Planning Board Workshop. The Planning Department, together with our consultants with Perkins and Will, Pluserbia, Helibert Sanchez and Associates, and Nancy Stroud and Associates, are here to discuss the proposed Resiliency Code. This is a needed update to our land development regulations, which have not been updated in 30 years. This is our second workshop. We're going to have a presentation where some of the changes that are going to be happening in the code will be presented, and then we'll go into detail into some of the new zoning districts and how the zoning districts will be oriented. This is not a substantive change to the code. We expect that the development patterns will continue much in the same way that they have today. However, we'll be incorporating significant benefits for resiliency and organizing the way the code is structured for improved transparency for staff, for the public, and for property owners. So with that, I'll turn it over. We have a presentation. If we can load that up.
Good morning. I assume we not only have the presentation, but we have our partners in Toronto online.
Yes, I see Anna's online. I see Eunice,
Okay.
Max, Nancy.
Perfect. So we have, thank you. You've met some of us before, but Brian, you weren't here last time, so let me reintroduce our team. As Rogelio said, this is a combination of professionals that hopefully you will feel is best equipped to help you with updating the code. My name is Jose Helibert, and I am with Perkins and Will here in Miami, and I have with us online my partners in Toronto, Anna Iannucci and Paul Kulig and Eunice Wong. You might, like I said last time, you might wonder, what does Toronto have to do with Miami Beach? But actually, we've also been working in Toronto, and how do you update a code when the city is in full development mode. Their problems are not seawater rise, their problems, believe it or not, are sunlight. We have too much, they have too little. So they've been working with us, I think, very effectively. And then in the rest of our team also includes Pluserbia, and with us today is Juan Muyerat, the founder of Pluserbia, and Maria Bentfeld, who you will hear a lot more from during this presentation. We also have Anna Helibert Sanchez. Anna is the former planning director of the city of Miami, and she was the person responsible, along with many others, for a similar major update on the code in Miami, which became Miami 21. And finally, last but not least, some might say the most important person in our team, Nancy Stroud. Nancy is an attorney who specializes in working with communities and updating codes, and also making sure that the code complies not only with local regulations, but also state regulations. And she's been working closely with Tom, Rogelio, and Alejandro in terms of also updating a number of the administrative portions of the code. So we'll show you that as well today. So some of you have seen parts of this presentation before, but what we decided to do is we're going to begin actually making, just spending a few minutes about the broader issues of what we were tasked to do. Mainly when we were asked to begin this project, it was a resiliency form-based code. We spent a lot of time working and updating the code. And for example, I know in our last discussion, we didn't have too much discussion on what our preliminary research into resiliency did. And so we're just going to spend a few minutes, and Paul's going to briefly summarize some of those things which we did before we did anything else. And at the end of the presentation, we have also taken a number of the comments that were made not only in the previous meeting with the planning board, but also we met with the land use committee, and we also got some feedback from them. So we're going to also take you through some questions that were asked and the responses, both from us and from the city. And as we were just telling Gail before we started, she sent us a very, very constructive email with a number of suggestions. And we're studying some, but a number of her very good suggestions have already been incorporated in the text that we're going to show you today. So I'd like to now pass it on to the Paul Kulig, my partner in Toronto, that will give you a background on the resiliency code background, and then Maria Benfeld to my left and Anna Iannucci in Toronto will take you through the code itself. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Jose. It's Paul Kulig from the Perkins & Will studio in Toronto, and just wanted to start by giving you a very quick background on our work and the approach we took to that. So we'll start with the first slide. Really, this was based on a thorough research of both best practices, but also the existing conditions that make Miami Beach unique. We looked at similar codes, comprehensive plans, and other statutes and regulations from both South Florida, as well as across the state and then across the US. And so we looked at things like Orlando, Boston's resilience guidelines, but especially New York's zoning code that was first enacted in 2012 and is actually being tested by the market. They've learned a few mistakes and they've since updated, which has given us a chance to learn from their mistakes and then adapt them to the unique conditions here in Miami Beach. Next is just a mapping, and I'm sure you've seen versions of this, of the long-term sea level rise. The important point being here is that the code we're developing is really going to govern buildings that could be in place 100 years into the future. And so we need to anticipate some of these changes, even if there may not be consensus around the exact projections of sea level rise. And so what we've done in the code is really sort of unique in this regard, in that it adapts to the projections in a kind of chronological form. And so any of the elevations, base flood elevations, design elevations will be adjusted as the projections go. And so we have an approach, and then it can adjust to the reality on the ground as it comes forward. Next, we also looked at how that translates into the land use regulations. So we looked at both the building types and how they're mapped out through the various districts, but we also paired that with infrastructure investments, especially road raisings, and understanding how those two will work together to shape the city, but also impact the sort of pedestrian and street life that makes Miami Beach so vibrant and attractive to visitors and residents alike. Next. And so all of that was sort of combined into a series of diagrams that looked at the impacts on both future buildings, the street connections, and then the important connections in the sidewalks that connect between those two. And these have been translated into elements of the code and the zoning regulations that Maria will be walking us through. One more point to make is that we're not really working from scratch. Next slide, please. But this exists and builds on past work. So on the left, you see the sea level rise strategy from Miami-Dade County. We've also looked at the Miami Beach's resilience plan. Each of those included recommendations and approaches to development within the city that we've considered, adapted, and looked to integrate into the code. So lastly, to summarize, just wanted to walk through some of the key codes. We've talked a lot about the need to adapt and mitigate for climate change and resilience. We've also, another important part through a lot of the stakeholder work was the need to modernize, simplify, and update the code while also protecting for quality of life. So making sure we maintain that balance that makes Miami Beach special. And then also safeguarding historic preservation. So we'll be seeing some elements around how that's achieved and integrated or preserved through elements of the code. And then ensuring clarity and transparency through the permitting process. And so there's a number of elements that look to simplify, but also make publicly accessible to broad group of stakeholders. And then lastly, allowing flexibility for the code to be updated in time. And so there's a bit of housekeeping work, but also baked in some opportunities for future amendments should those be desired. And so I think with that, I'm going to pass things over to Anna first to help us understand the structure of the code. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. So what we're going to do now is run through the major proposed changes to each of the chapters of the code. For the most part, I'll do this very quickly because most of you have seen this before, but because I think we do have some new faces here today, we did want to make sure that we recapped what we're proposing for each of the chapters. So once again, here is the proposed structure of the code. It's very much a direct translation of the chapters in the current LDRs, with the slight exception that sustainability and resiliency has been incorporated into the beginning of Chapter 7, Zoning Districts and Regulations, and that's to make sure that it's up front and center, isn't siloed off by itself, but permeates everything within the code. And as Jose said, we will be spending the majority of our time today with Maria Benfeld taking us on a deep dive into the changes that we're proposing to Chapter 7, specifically running through the changes to the RS districts and CD2. So just a reminder as I go through quick slides on each of the chapters. On each of these slides, you'll see a word or several words in the top right. They'll just go back to the goals for the code update that Paul just went through and describe the major reasons behind the code changes that are proposed for each chapter. So in Chapter 1, General Provisions, the changes are really about simplifying the navigability of definitions in the code by consolidating them all in Chapter 1 and organizing them by type, and clarifying roles and processes. There's a new section that's been added, Administration of Regulations, which clarifies the role of the planning director to interpret the land development regulations. Chapter 2, Administration and Review Procedures. As Jose said, we have a land use attorney on our team, Nancy Stroud, who is working with the city attorney's office to update this chapter, and she is here today and can answer any questions. But just in the interest of time, I'll just run through some of the changes she's proposing very quickly right now. Mostly the updates to this chapter are just about standardizing and clarifying procedural requirements, in particular standardizing general application procedures for all land use applications, including pre-application requirements, standardizing a general hearing procedure applications. Another thing that she's proposing is to establish a zoning amendment cycle of 4 times a year. That's something that got some discussion at our last meeting and that I think people seem to think was a positive improvement to procedure. And also she's proposing an additional commission waiver of a percentage of certain LDRs, which will allow for better project design after planning board recommendation and design review approval. So if there's any comments or questions on this chapter, Nancy is here and we can discuss later. For Chapter 3, Concurrency Management and Mobility Fees, there really are no substantial changes proposed. Chapter 4, Landscape Requirements, is quite new. I think it was just updated in about 2016. So it's quite minor changes here, mostly regarding promoting shade trees and drought and salt tolerant species that are suitable for Miami Beach and increasing stormwater permeability, particularly in parking lots. I will spend a moment on the changes proposed to the off-street parking chapter, Chapter 5, because those are a little bit more significant. The goal of the changes to this chapter is to modernize and simplify parking requirements and set in place a structure where reduced parking requirement areas can be aligned with transit hubs and corridors as they're defined in the comprehensive plan and in alignment with work that's currently being done to update the transportation master plan. So what this means in terms of changes to the code now is that parking requirements have been reorganized into tables, similar to tables that have been introduced into the zoning districts and regulations chapter. And where there were very similar uses with very similar parking requirements, those have been consolidated. We've also consolidated the current 9 parking districts into the 3 parking tiers, and you can see that in the 2 images on the screen today, or on the screen on the right there. Tier 1 encompasses the former parking district 1, so that covers most of the city and has standard parking requirements. Tier 2 covers former parking districts 5, 6, and 9. We see those as sort of areas with intermediate parking requirements. And Tier 3 covers former parking districts 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8, and has the lowest parking requirements. So once again, we have not changed the parking requirements other than when we're consolidating slightly different requirements from slightly different, that were slightly different in the different parking districts into one parking requirement for the new parking tier. We've generally selected the lowest one if there were slight differences there, but we have not gone in and made changes overall to the requirements. But really what we're doing is putting in place a simpler and more logical and more easy to use structure that can be used if further parking reductions are considered as part of a future amendment to the code. The other major changes to this chapter are that bike parking requirements have been expanded citywide for certain select uses, and there's been a new section added regarding repair or rehabilitation of non-conforming parking lots. And then finally for me, before I pass over to Maria, the updates to the signs chapter are fairly minor and are mostly about simplifying and clarifying requirements and review responsibilities, primarily by adding or clarifying definitions, adding graphic exhibits, and standardizing requirements where sometimes there is a bit of inconsistency. So now I will pass over to Maria to take us through chapter 7.
Thank you, Anna, and I apologize in advance for the very technical presentation that I'm about to give you and all the information that you'll have to process. This has been a long process in which we've carefully, reviewed, cleaned up, translated, and simplified the code, and we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So to recap, the goals of these efforts were to address climate adaptation and resilience, simplify, clean up, and update the code, safeguard historic preservation, clarify and create transparency in the code, and allow flexibility for future updates. So in the general to all zoning districts, like we presented a couple of weeks ago, this addresses resilience, and we integrated and enhanced the sustainability and resilience chapter and moved it to the general to all districts. So the resilience-related regulations permeate the district regulations. Resilience, adaptation, and mitigation are now the most prominent in this section. And we also moved and incorporated regulations that are common to all districts that were repeated over and over again in each one of the districts into the general to all, and then we make reference to that in each one of the districts. Some examples are, the minimum unit sizes, frontages, and parking screening standards. And moving on, like Anna mentioned before, we're going to go through the details of 2 zoning districts, RSs and the CD2s. Next slide. So if you're an applicant, for example, and you want to know the regulations for a house in Elton Road between 46th and 47th Street, you go to the zoning map, you find your districts, in that case it's RS4, and these are the existing regulations. So first you look into what uses are allowed. This is the uses section in the existing code. In this case it's short, but it's all in text format. So next slide. We simplified that. We created a table, and we translated all of these paragraphs into tables, and if there are any supplemental use regulations, you can easily find them following the table. So for example, there, and I think you can read it, you can look into religious institutions, for example, and find that if it's allowed as a conditional use, it has an asterisk right next to it, and then you go down in the supplemental conditional use regulations and you find that they're only allowed in the 40th Street overlay. And there's a map key where you'll be able to click on that and view it on a map and see what properties are affected by that. And so that's the way we've tried to simplify the uses section. Next slide. So you move on to the development regulations, and this is how development regulations for single-family residential districts are structured in the current code. First, you find the tables with the unit sizes, heights, lot areas, coverage, and lot widths. Next. Then you have to scroll down through several pages of specific standards for height exception, lot coverage, understory standards, yard requirements, until you finally find the setback requirements. Next slide. So to make the code simpler, clearer, and more user-friendly, we combine the development regulations tables and text into a table where everything is in the same place. The standards in all districts have the same table structure. And this is an example of how the table starts with FAR, density that we brought from the comprehensive plan, minimum unit size, lot area, lot widths, lot coverage, and to find information in the RS4, you go to that column, and then you find, for example, that the minimum lot width is 50 feet. Easy. Next slide. So further down on the table, you will find the building setbacks, clearly showing the front, sides, and rear setbacks accompanied by a plan exhibit that's shown on the right, with a reference letter that shows where these setbacks apply. So you clearly have what the front setback is and where it is, where the side facing a street is, the back, and the interior sides. And next slide. And next on the table are the heights. Now, we clearly show the heights allowed in each one of the RS districts. We kept the same heights that are allowed right now. Future amendments can be done after this code is adopted. So, for example, in RS4, you see that 24 and 27 feet are allowed for slope roofs and for flat roofs. You go further down the table, and there's some notes. So if you see a number right next to for example, the RS3 flat roofs, if you see number 4, then you know that you may increase the height to 28 or 27, depending on what type of roof you have, through Design Review Board or Historic Preservation Board. So understories we're proposing that understories are allowed now by right without having to go through DRB or HPB approval. If a single family house has an understory, the height may be increased by 3 feet. And the reason for this is because when we studied a house that has understories, typically the design flood elevation falls below. So for one of the things, understory with a minimum height of 10 feet places the residential first habitable level above the maximum design flood elevation, as you can see on the exhibit on the lower right-hand corner. Therefore, 3 additional feet are appropriate to be able to achieve comfortable floor-to-ceiling heights above the first habitable level. Next slide. So in the existing code, what happens if you want to build a carport, for example? This is how the existing standards for the allowable encroachments within the required yard look like. Next slide. And this is how the proposed table, where the text was translated into a table with exhibits showing where those specific setbacks apply. So, for example, if you want to know how close your carport to the front of a property line can be, you go to the table, you find front setback, and you see that it's 18 inches for the carport and 15 feet for the solar carport. And moving on to CD2, the commercial medium intensity district. Next slide. Yeah. In commercial medium intensity district, for example, if you want to find what's allowed in Alton Road north of 6th Street, the uses in the existing code are listed mostly in long paragraph, where it's very difficult to find what uses are permitted, conditional, accessory, and what those specific conditions are. So sometimes we find that the uses are only allowed or prohibited in specific geographic locations, or accessory uses are listed in another completely different section at the end of the code. Next slide. So in the proposed code, we have simplified and clarified all uses into tables. Because the existing code has supplemental language, any supplemental language remains. and it shows up after the tables. For example, you will find that self-storage warehouse, for example. Next slide. You want to find, for example, self-storage warehouses are allowed, and you see that on the table as a conditional use. But it has a supplemental use, it's within the supplemental use regulations. So you go to the supplemental conditional use regulations immediately below the table and find that self-storage warehouses are only allowed as conditional use in the south of Alton Road corridor, and that the minimum distance between the self-storage warehouse is 300 feet. So you'll easily be able to find that information. Again, each district has the same simple table format and supplemental use regulations following the table.
Maria, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you go back to that slide? So certain uses are listed as prohibited.
Yes.
But then there's prohibited with an asterisk, which says see supplemental use.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be a conditional use? What is prohibited with an asterisk?
For example, some uses are prohibited only in specific geographic areas. So they're allowed in the district, but prohibited only in specific geographic locations. So that's when you see an asterisk and you go to the prohibited uses and you see that. Or for example, they're prohibited within certain hours of operation or something like that. So that's where those asterisks and those supplemental, we kept all of those geographic exceptions, hours of operation, and all of that remained in the code, and that's
So
why
it just indicates it's not a blanket prohibition, bottom line.
No, exactly, yes. Where you see prohibited without the asterisk is blanket prohibited, yes. So moving on to the next slide. So as you know, most of the complicated issues in any zoning code is the back and forth between the map and the text and finding where things are affected. So this example shows how we created an exhibit map key. So you'll see it when you see the draft that we submitted, you'll see that there are some geographic locations highlighted in red, and they have a key. They'll say like map exhibit such and such. So we created an exhibit map key where all of the geographic exceptions have been mapped in GIS and will be translated to the GridX platform, where a user will be able to click on the text and view the location on a map and find what properties are affected by that specific, for example, in this case, the supplemental conditional use regulation for Sunset Harbor.
This is chapter 7.
This is chapter 7, yes. So moving on to the next slide. So in CD2 and most districts, the development regulations are divided in 2 tables. So I'm sorry that this is not legible, but it's on purpose, so you'll see. One has FAR, minimum and average unit sizes, height, lot area, and lot widths, and the other table has setbacks. The existing regulations have oceanfront setbacks, but as you can see on the zoning map on the right, there are no oceanfront lots in CD2. So we deleted those provisions, making the code clearer and shorter. All conditional common to all districts, all conditions common to all districts, such as the minimum unit sizes. Like I said before, were moved to the general to all districts section of the chapter instead of repeating it over and over in each section. Next slide. So what you see on the table has been converted into a cleaner table that's at the beginning in section 1 of chapter 7. In addition, we found that removing average unit sizes by removing the average minimum unit size, the average unit sizes, the code calculations and enforcements were improved, and it's easier to interpret and to review. So as I showed you before, in the RS districts, all development regulations tables have the same structure. Next. Minimum unit sizes are made reference to the table at the beginning of chapter 7, and if there are any exceptions, they are clearly listed on the table below. So you'll see that as an example, the table applies, but then for contributing hotel structures located within Collins Park District, the minimum hotel unit is 200 feet. So it's clear on the table. Next slide. And because this district has higher allowable height, the setbacks are broken up by subterranean pedestal and tower setbacks. the same way that it is in the code right now, but the standards are better organized and have the same structure for all zoning districts. Next. So front and side facing a street, and next. This is where we also make reference to the general to all the zoning districts. So for example, here, we make reference to the resilience and adaptation standards. So even though the setback for the subterranean pedestal and tower are 0 on the front setback, you still have to go into the resilience and adaptation standards for buildings to see if you comply with the 15 feet that are required for the long and short frontage standards. Next slide. So the tables have clear reference to the notes that are found at the end of the text. Next slide. So, for example, in a mixed-use commercial building for a non-residential first habitable level that complies, if they comply with the height requirements of 14 feet above design flood elevation, it's clearly shown that 5 feet are additional height are allowed without having to go through DRB or DRB or HPB, as noted in the caption. Next slide. So in the existing code, the development regulations for Washington Avenue properties in CD2 show up in text format. So it's different than how it shows up in the general CD2 regulations. So as you can see, the order in which the development regulations show up in a different order. So it starts with the front setbacks, and then it goes to the rear setbacks, and then it goes to the side setbacks. And then the unit sizes show after the setbacks. This is different from how it shows up in other districts. So next slide. In the proposed code, we organize the regulations in the same format as the other tables, and this makes the code clearer and consistent and predictable. Next slide. So because this is a unique case and sub-district within the CD2, setback regulations are a little different than in the zoning, than in the general zoning districts, but they're organized in the same way consistently. So the difference here, for example, is that the ground level has a setback, but then it's not broken up in, the pedestal or the tower. They clearly say that above the ground up to 35 feet, your setback, and then above 35 feet, you'll clearly see it on the map. So the existing development regulations did not change, and they were simply translated into the same table format. Next slide. And so the same happened to the next slide. So the same happened with the heights. The existing development regulations did not change, and they were simply translated into the table. And I know that was a lot, and I know you'll probably have questions, so thank you. And now Rogelio, I think he's going to go over some of the questions.
Next slide, please. Okay, so last time we received some questions from the board members, so we wanted to go through them. So the first one is if the 50% rule can be clarified, can replacement values be standardized? With this, we don't have an easy, clear-cut answer. We are researching to see if there are other ways that other cities do this, and working with the building official to see what we can do with the Florida Building Code, because she has certain requirements that she has to follow for coming up with these numbers. So next question. Can property history for each property be made publicly available without having to go through staff? We currently have online permitting and land use board approvals post 2016 available via our citizen self-service portal, where you can search for property address, and that will give you the approvals of the property. Prior to that, we don't have everything digitized, so if anybody would like to see any order prior to that, they would have to email staff at this point, but we're looking for ways that we can improve that as time goes on.
Can I ask a quick question? So when a potential purchaser of a property looks at a property, what do they typically do? They'll email you and ask for the entire property history?
Correct, yeah, and
restrictions, things like that?
Yeah, sometimes, most of the time, these orders are recorded on the property, so a property owner can look them up through the Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser, through the Miami-Dade County Clerk of Courts, and find the documents recorded on the property that way. If they're not there, then we would have to do a record request and pull boxes out of storage, which could take us some time because some of these conditional uses or other types of permits go back 30, 40 years, and we just don't have them digitized. So next slide, please. Will there be changes to what can change by variance or waiver? Some flexibility for the director to administer the code is required. So we anticipate that if that is to happen, changes to variance process or waivers, that would be in phase 2. We're not proposing any changes like that at this moment. There is a process that we're proposing for city commission waivers, with the idea that instead of doing code amendments for specific projects, that they could go through a waiver process instead tied to a specific development, as opposed to just generally applying an amendment to the code without any guarantees as to what project we're going to get. So that's why we get so many code amendments every month. So next slide.
And to that point, if we kept the structure the way it is now, we're proposing to limit the amount of times that the code changes per year, right?
Correct, to 4 times a year. Yep.
So somebody would have to wait for one of those.
One of those cycles, yeah. There is a provision where if the city commission by 5/7 vote decides that it needs to proceed prior to that time coming forward, that would be available. Sometimes we do have, sometimes a use needs to be removed from the list. Sometimes there's an emergency type issue like that. So we'll be able to handle those. But for your general code amendments, we're proposing that they be 4 times a year. Next slide, please. Can there be a specific timeline for when applications and supporting documents can be submitted to allow for appropriate review time for the board and the public? Yes, there are limitations for submittals to the city, and like we said, we have we're proposing a 4-time-a-year submittal requirement. And then our code does have requirements for for private applications, the timing when they have to submit to staff, the review period, and the time frame for documents to be uploaded and available to the public is also within that code section.
That exists already.
Yeah, that exists already.
So this is not a change.
This is the time. We're codifying a lot of what our practices are in terms of the submittal process. Currently, that's our internal process. Right now, we're going to put it into the code so it's very clear what's going to be happening, the process that we expect everybody to go through. But the requirement that all applications be submitted to staff 30 days prior, that does exist today, and that's not changing. So everything that the public may want to see in terms of an application would be in our office or online 30 days prior to the hearing. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking while you're talking. And if somebody wanted to submit a supplemental whatever for an application, they could do that within the 30 days?
They would have to present that to the board at the public hearing, and the board would have to decide if they're okay accepting that or not.
I know we've had instances where things are late breaking. And
Yeah, we do not want, once it's the 30-day period, we don't want a project changing suddenly and then the public is not aware of a change that happened. Somebody that looked at it on the 29th day and then the project changes on the 15th day. That wouldn't be fair to the public, so we don't want that to happen. Next question. Are there any existing zoning districts that have outlived their purpose and can they be removed from the code? We have removed not ARM, this is a typo, it's the RO2 and RO3 have been removed from the code because they were adopted into the zoning ordinance, but they were never placed on the map. So they technically don't exist on the map, so we don't have RO2 and RO3. So those were removed from the code. I think the question is more related to the spirit of our existing zoning districts and if the intent of our zoning districts is what we want. And so the remainder of our zoning districts are very active. We have development in all of our zoning districts. They're on the map. And so those are continually evolving. So if we see that there are issues with what's happening in a certain area, we work on amendments to transform those districts into something else and change the vision for those areas, which is something that's actively happening in the MXC district, where we're looking at how that area can evolve. So next slide. Is there a way to codify a fairer process for balancing competing interests to avoid the situation where the loudest case wins? The quasi-judicial procedures are spelled out in a more detail in our what's being proposed, and these procedures are what's required by law to ensure that all interested parties have a fair process and that board decisions are based on fact and the law. I don't know if our attorneys that are online have any more to add to that, but that's the process, and we are becoming more transparent with that process with the code amendments. So we are trying to improve on that. Next slide, please. Can there be procedural changes to help the layperson understand proposed ordinance changes, agenda titling, exact density, total square footage, height, and renderings? There are specific legal requirements that all titles must include, and such as they must have the section that authorizes the amendment, they must have every single section that's being amended, the names of each section, the names of each division of each article. So we have all these requirements that do make our titles lengthy and sometimes difficult to read, but they must be there. There's no way to get around having all of that information. And also ordinance amendments are intended to be for a generalized area, not for specific developments. So you are typically, when you're looking at a zoning amendment, you're not looking at the specifics of a project such as the setbacks. You're looking at general massing for what could be built. So one of the goals is with this waiver process is that proposals to amend the code are reduced, and that you would have a waiver process that's specific to a development, and as part of that waiver, you would have very specific details as to what is going to be built, as opposed to the way we do it today, where you're just looking at an ordinance that's more generalized.
Two questions about that. One, who would that waiver process go through?
It would follow the same process as an ordinance, so it would come to the planning board first and then to the city commission. It would basically be like an ordinance, but it would be project specific. So a lot of times you get an ordinance amendment, we're going to raise the height limit in this specific area 20 feet. It comes to the planning board and then goes to 2 readings at the city commission. And then that applies to several properties that could take advantage of that. But really the idea is that we want that for one specific type of a project. So the idea here is instead of amending the code, they would come in for this waiver process and we would have very detailed project in it, and the waiver would be specific to that project, where if that project were to change, they would have to come back and get another waiver.
And is that intended to be a simpler process or just more targeted?
More targeted. The process would be the same. Yeah.
And when it comes to ordinance amendments, we had the case recently where we amended an ordinance and it was difficult to visualize the impact of that. Do you think we could, in the future, like have, zoning envelope and illustrate the differences of what we're talking about through diagrams like they've been showing?
That's definitely something we try to do most of the time. With the waiver process, you should have a project before you, so you'll see very specifically what you're going to get.
For waiver,
yeah.
But we still will have ordinance amendments, I guess.
Really, on the last sentence, and it's going to come up actually on Tuesday because I got a call from a resident that is upset that the overlay in North Beach is not, where the Deauville is not going to apply to his properties.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying in the future that instead of trying to amend or further amend the amendment, then he could come for a specific.
For certain things. So that's Tuesday's meeting. I don't want to get into the details of Tuesday's meeting. But so it wouldn't apply to, you couldn't do a waiver for FAR, of density, of things that are in the comprehensive plan. It would have to, whatever your waivers has to be something that's consistent with the comprehensive plan. Density, intensity are not things that we could do as part of the waiver process. And also the waiver would have a limit of a specific percentage. So if you want to exceed that percentage, then that would be an ordinance amendment.
Right, and this is probably for another day, but how are the boundaries of an overlay decided? By staff.
That's a great question. We look at an area and see what makes sense, where the character, the built context of the city has different character in different areas, and you kind of see where the character changes all of a sudden. So the overlay is intended to protect an area that has a similar character, like we have an overlay for Sunset Harbor. Sunset Harbor has a specific type of character that's very different from the neighborhoods around it. It has physical boundaries such as Alton Road, the Dade Canal. We look at different things as to when the character suddenly changes or when there's a physical boundary that should cause us to change the regulations.
Right. Okay, because my concern is the fairness where, it would appear that it's being done for a project and really not for a zone. You know what I mean? Because it only affects a certain parcel versus multiple parcels and.
If I can add on to that, and we'll discuss that case Tuesday, but is it the applicant who suggests the boundaries of an overlay, or is it staff?
Sometimes it's the applicant. It varies on where the overlay is originating from. Applicants do have the right to apply for zoning changes and zoning amendments. So it's both.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Is there a way to incentivize adaptive reuse rather than demolishing and building new? Absolutely, there are ways. There are the ability to allow certain exceptions to uses and waivers to the code regulations within certain density zones, as long as it does not increase the allowable density and intensity and height requirements and promotes and encourages preservation and adaptive reuse of historic properties. So certainly we can incorporate.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, hi, Tanya. So certainly, we can incorporate things into the code. Another one, consider reductions or exemptions of parking requirements for properties seeking adaptive reuse, and promote the character and quality of life and goals of the city. So the ways to do it are allowing uses that can encourage the adaptive reuse of a property. We've recently done that, for example, some properties where we have allowed office development, where office development previously was not allowed, as a way to incentivize adaptive reuse. And also reducing parking requirements so that if you are going to add on to a historic building, that addition wouldn't require you to provide for new parking, because sometimes in a historic district it's just impossible to do. So these are some of the ways that we can do it, and I'm sure there are others that we can explore. Next slide, please. Next steps. I think, is the team going to go through the next steps, or I can go through it? Okay. Next steps are, we're here at the workshop. The next public meeting will be, there will be a land use committee meeting on July 7th, where the land use committee will be discussing these new code changes. And then on July 26th, will be the planning board transmittal meeting. So this code will come to the planning board on July 26th. Hopefully with a favorable recommendation to the City Commission, and then the City Commission will consider this at first reading on their September meeting, and then hopefully adoption in the October meeting. And after that, the code will contain several months for an effective date, so it allows staff and the public to transition, so it's not going to take effect immediately. There will be a couple months where we'll have the ability to inform everybody of the new requirements, allow us to train our staff, and come up with our specific procedures that will be necessary as we move forward. And then at that point, we will start looking at any other amendments that may be necessary to consolidate changes that may have been made in the interim, and then anything else that may be necessary to encourage the resiliency of the city and protect our neighborhoods. So with that, next slide. I think that's it. So with that, I guess we can have a public hearing if there's anybody from the public that would like to speak. And if anybody who's online listening would like to speak also, but sure, Mr. Shedroff, feel free to approach. Anybody who's online that would like to speak, please raise their hand and we'll call on you at the appropriate time.
Hi, my name's Adam Shedroff. I live at 520 16th Street on Miami Beach. My family has lived here about 75, 80 years now. Not me personally, but my grandparents, my parents, my kids live here now. I wanted to find out, does anything that you're doing affect entertainment districts, reorganizing entertainment districts, expanding entertainment districts, consolidating entertainment districts?
At this point, what's in the code is exactly the same as what's in there today. The City Commission, as a separate initiative, is considering specific regulations for entertainment and alcoholic beverage establishments. That's a separate initiative unrelated to the Resiliency Code. Whatever's decided as part of that will be incorporated into this new code.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Online, we have Joseph Magazine.
Hi, everyone. Really appreciate everybody's time, especially the civil servants here that are kind of doing this in their spare volunteer time. This has been incredibly insightful and helpful. One of the issues that was raised just in the past couple of slides was about adaptive reuse. And just kind of spitballing here, brainstorming, and perhaps thinking outside the box. That's something that's very important to me. However, I realize that sometimes that meets economic challenges, where if you have a structure and it's kind of outlived its useful life or just has constraints on the property that may not make it economically feasible to essentially do some sort of adaptive reuse. Are there other things that could be almost traded or offset as an incentive that gets us towards our resiliency goals if that adaptive reuse wouldn't be able to be achieved? So for instance, again, just completely spitballing here, we saw a building in Flamingo Park, I believe, where it lost its roof. If buildings like that, maybe it's not economically feasible to do an adaptive reuse, but if they would do kind of a redevelopment that would be within maybe replicate the Art Deco structure, stay within the zoning and variance requirements, but they would add on some resiliency features, whether it be solar panels or a green roof or things like that, where, okay, we're not able to adaptively reuse this. However, we are putting in other ways to essentially get us towards some of our resiliency goals. Is that something that would be feasible or be able to be explored? Again, thank you all for your time, and look forward to seeing you in person at the planning board meeting next week.
If I can just start, we mentioned last time that one of the other issues that we have been discussing with staff is vehicle or mechanisms like transfer development rights. And we were talking with Gail and Adam at the beginning. You know, we can't always expect or count on the state government or the federal government to pay for resiliency improvements. So one of the things that we have been discussing is transfer of development rights have been used very effectively. Actually, it started with the preservation of historic districts. So one of the things we've been discussing is, okay, you want to maintain the character or you want to maintain a number of the features, say, for example, in a community or a section of the city like Flamingo Park. How do you do that and basically fund, whether it's that your roof, as Mr. Magazine has just explained, fallen off, or you want to flood-proof your ground floor without raising the whole building. So one of the things, the mechanisms is, well, maybe you can maintain your density, your height right now, but then to other parts of the city that might be, can handle, you know, a small measure of additional development. Well, with those funds, you can actually enhance and preserve the historic district. But since that involves issues like FAR sometimes, and again, as we all know, that has to go to a citywide referendum, we have not included it in this phase of the code. We're basically providing things that can be done with you and with the city commission. But certainly that is something that we really believe that as a second phase of this code, the discussion should continue. I don't know, Paul or Maria, if you want to.
So, online we have board member Tanya Bat, and we also have Yahil Cement online. Just wanted to let everybody know for the record. And Tanya's hand is raised. So if you would like to speak.
Hi, thanks, Rogelio. Thank you, everybody, for this presentation. I look forward to reviewing it in more detail when I'm not at work. I have a couple of thoughts. One is to build on Joe Magazine's comments about adaptive reuse. You know, one of the most damaging things for sustainability and resilience issues is the demolishing of the building. There are countless number of academic papers detailing how damaging that is for our environmental concerns. And I would like to have that addressed someplace. I'm not sure how to do it as a code item per se or specifically, but if it can be included, as a paragraph or something with perhaps some relevant citations, because I think, we're holding ourselves out as a city that is really focused on this. And the biggest, of the things that we can control, I mean, there are things that we cannot, but whether or not we let a building stand and find a way to retrofit it or upgrade it or build onto it versus whether we demolish it and build something new is entirely within our control. And I do think that needs to be addressed with like I said, with links to documentation that supports that point, and any other ways to incorporate that thought process as we go through. Two other very small points. Going back to the topic of titling, I understand that the language is very proscribed by legal requirements, but this is something we've talked about before. The way the titles, and it's really dumb small things, so it should be a really easy thing to change. The way titles are presented in agenda documents and on the agendas themselves is in very tightly kerned, all capital letter sentences. And if there's a way to do it in regular or even first letter capitalized of each word to make it just easier, literally easier to read. I mean, purely just for comprehension's sake of the letters and words, not even including the content of what those letters and words are saying. I don't believe that part is prescribed by law to do it in a particular font with all caps and tightly kerned. So if that's something that we could make a change to, that would be really helpful. And then on a separate note, I would like to see included in every application, and if it, and or I'm not sure if it needs to be both, or specifically from the applicant or specifically from the staff analysis, a massing study where it's relevant. Anytime we're talking about changing FAR or heights or aggregating lots or any of those things, it's not very common to see massing studies unless they are specifically requested, and that's not upon first application, first discussion of the application. It's very hard for people to visualize what it could look like when you're saying going from 3.0 FAR to 4.5 FAR, 2.0 to 3.0 FAR, because, to the layperson out there, that's a pretty esoteric discussion. But if you can show a massing study of it could look like this or it could look like this, there are 3 or 4 different ways it could look, nothing to do with the aesthetics of the project, but just, how that amount of space could conceivably fit into the land upon which it would sit. I think that's a critical thing that has to be added, and it should be absolutely for every project coming before the commission, the boards involved, etc. And with that, I will mute myself again. Thank you all.
Oh, I had a question. Tanya, I had only had like 2 questions, and that was one of them. The typeset, the same font and not capitalize it. A lot of people complain to me about that. It's hard to read. And the other question I had was the overlays. As you know, we've got like a ton of overlays. You've kind of fixed the parking overlay. I'm really glad to see that. But, there's zoning overlays over zoning overlays. So is there any way to eliminate the overlays? Because I always say if an ordinance is passed that creates an overlay, if that ordinance is really good, then why shouldn't it be included for the entire zoning district? Why? I know sometimes why, because like on Alton Road is commercial and you don't want that up and down Alton Road in the single family home neighborhoods. But in general, I think it should be more standardized, these rules and laws, instead of making another overlay. Thank you.
Well, we did incorporate some of the overlays that affected, for example, one zoning district. For example, we saw it today, the 40th Street overlay that affected religious institutions in 4, exactly. We did incorporate that in RS because it was, it was a very small overlay and it only affected a few properties in RS4. So that was incorporated as part of the RS districts. But there are others that affect more zoning districts and that are very specific to geographic location and not just a zoning district. So it's harder to incorporate that into the zoning districts, but wherever we could, we did.
Okay.
They did do some cleanup in terms of, they merged the oceanfront overlay and the dune preservation overlay because
Yes.
they really cover the same properties.
Yeah.
So to simplify those regulations, they kind of merged them into one. And generally, when you do an overlay, it's because it's because two different zoning districts have something in common and you want to unify them in some sort. So Sunset Harbor, for example, has RM3, I1, and CD2 zoning districts, but there is some commonality to the district, so that has an overlay that encompasses those 3 different zoning districts that kind of unifies them to have a similar feel and protect the character of that community. Other times it's when you have a very large district, but a small portion of that large district has something unique about it that you want to protect. And so that's why we have so many overlays, because we have so many different neighborhoods in the city that have a different feel from others.
Is there,
How generally are communities that like our community that has real sea level rise threat, how do they reconcile the preservation with sea level rise, where a building that's historic is built at a certain grade or level, and yet if you believe sea level rise is happening, which I think most of us do, that they could be underwater one day and the owners can't do anything about that? Like, how do they reconcile that?
Let me just start the answer, and Paul, feel free to jump in. That's actually a great question, and as you know, there was even a study that preceded our study done by Schulman and Associates for the historic district, and there were a number of proposals of literally raising buildings. And
which is what a lot of communities do
yeah, and
outside of Miami.
the challenge with us, and Alan's a good friend, and I've been teaching with Alan now for a long, long time. And I said, Alan, you know how a lot of these buildings are built in the first place. And some of them, if you begin to raise them, they're just going to collapse. Because frankly, a lot of these buildings here in the beach were not built that well to begin with. They were built with sand and from the salt water and all of that. So, of course, like Nick is saying, if you had a wood structured building, it's much simpler. You can just jack it up and it works. So that's a question we asked ourselves, and I said, okay, what can we really realistically do here? And one of the things, and I mentioned this in the context of the transfer of development rights, is, for the person who owns a property in Flamingo Park, for example, it might not be feasible to raise the building. Frankly, they're not going to get the rents back that are going to justify the cost of raising it. So for some of those folks, it might be flood-proofing the buildings so that, and I'm sure you also found that little animation of the rising. It's a little scary. And again, we could take the attitude, as some people do, well, not in my lifetime, but it will be in our children's lifetime, and we don't want this to become Venice. Well, parts of Venice, yes, maybe not all of Venice. So I think a lot of the time what we have seen is that there are incentives to be able to comply with it. And I always felt, because I also see the projects, as Nick does as an architect, and I always felt the biggest impact here is really going to be with new development, whether it's a new project that's going up in Alton Road, or whether it's a new house that's going up in North Bay Road. And that discussion that Maria talked about, the understory and all of that, those things are, to me, quite critical, because, this situation we have now is obviously, we weren't aware in 1928 of seawater rise, so now we have buildings that might be flooded, but now we know. So to build a single-family residence, knowing that in a few years, you're going to have a couple of feet of water from where you're building it, at the very least is irresponsible. So I think that some of the things that have been done now through, whether it's in the commercial or the residential, through variances, hopefully would find their way into the code, which we're proposing in some things, to add a bit of an additional height, to unify the height, so that you can plan for the fact that you're going to get water for the first couple of feet, and you're not going to be underwater then.
Which is why I asked you about preservation, because that's the challenge, and it's, I don't know if there's an answer. I mean, it's a very difficult question, but.
And, one of the things we found that was actually interesting is whenever I think in here, and every time we have king tide, or every time we have a heavy rain like we had a couple of weeks ago, I think of West Avenue. And when we make the national news is West Avenue. I was surprised to see, for example, in areas like Ocean Drive, believe it or not, it's pretty high up already. So those folks are actually covered for the time being.
Sunset Harbor, after raising the roads, it was dry during all those rains.
Well, actually, now the other issue is the raising of the roads. And that is something that, again, as we begin to rise, there's seawater rise, there's a raising of the roads, and so on. So what we're trying to do is that, again, the code reflects that there is going to be a number of shifts, whether it's by natural process or whether it is by raising of the roads, that we know, if the street across from you is going to be raised, then, you don't want it to happen like what happened to the guy with a poor restaurant in Sunset Harbor that all of a sudden found himself with a basement and he didn't know he had one. So I think those things are some of the things that's why we wanted to sort of start the presentation today with some of the analysis of resiliency. And it was interesting when we started with that at one point, not any of the folks in this room, but they would say, no, the city doesn't want to see those things anymore. Every presentation is about how the whole city is going to be flooded. Just don't focus on that. And but actually, after the last presentation, they said, well, maybe we should just at least spend a few minutes acknowledging that that's happening. And again, Paul showed, I know it was quick, and it was a couple of images of, we studied the code in Boston, or the code in New York, especially how new construction is addressed if you have to raise it. And they've actually come up with with a series of things that we pretty much studied. Obviously, what happens when you raise it, we still have to deal with ADA. And yeah, we can raise a few steps, but then if you're in a wheelchair, you have to get them up. So raising sometimes implies, a significant change in that area. And these cities have done things like not count in the FAR the area that you need to transition to make it higher, because basically you're providing a transition. And again, that raises, as architects, we're very conscious of it, is what kind of a streetscape are you creating? You know, and this is sort of a conflict with Seawater Rise, because we want things to be down on the floor, but then there has to be a transition. So what does it feel to be walking down the street in which things are raised? So it's an interesting thing, but I'm glad that Miami Beach at this juncture is really considering it, because again, cities like Paul said, you know, Boston, New York, Orlando, Tampa have begun doing it. So, Paul, I don't know, you want to talk a little more about the other examples?
Thanks, Jose. I think you've covered off a lot of the issues and challenges well, and I'll maybe just summarize by saying that the concerns and the path forward around historic districts is something that requires a kind of a broad mix of inputs, whether it's the owners, the insurance companies, the municipality, the infrastructure, or other groups, and the code is a part of that. And so I think where possible, the changes proposed open the door for future work. They establish the relationships, like you said, between the street, the sidewalk, the buildings. But we understand there's likely still going to be a gap there, financial gap. And so some of the future amendments that we've proposed, like some of the TDR, could start to bridge that gap. But there's likely going to be more work to follow to really kind of close that. And it likely will be a kind of building by building assessment. So as far as the tools, I think, Jose, you've identified it. I think there are some paths forward, and something that we'll likely be proposing for the city staff to pursue in future amendments.
Is there anyone else from the public?
We have no other hands raised.
I just have a few questions. You mentioned in Chapter 2 a new process for commission approval allowing the exemption of 25% of design parameters, something like that.
You're talking about the waiver process? Yep, 25% would be the initial thought, yeah.
So that means if you go to design review board and there are conditions put in place, they could waive 25% of them?
It wouldn't be a waiver of design review board conditions, it would be a waiver of code requirements.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm. And it would still be subject to the design review board approval or HPB approval. I mean, it wouldn't waive that process. They could still do their job as they do today.
How do you, where does the 25% come from? I'm just curious how you quantify it.
We looked at a lot of the different ordinances that we've had over time, and a way to basically not require them, that would be the number that we would need.
So there's a certain amount of district regulations or something, and they could waive 25% of that?
Mm-hmm. Today, with a code amendment, you can waive the whole thing. You can do, whatever.
I'm wondering where's the threshold of 25%? I'm not sure.
It came from looking at a history of amendments that we've had, and that seemed like a good number where we wouldn't need a lot of the ones that we've had to do over the last couple of years. And we would have a specific, so instead of the ordinance amendment amending the code, somebody would come with a development proposal. You would see the building that they're proposing, and determine if it's merited to give them the waiver or not. The same way you would determine if an ordinance is merited or not.
But in terms of the 25%, it would be like, there's setback regulations. We could waive that. That counts as one. Mm-hmm. And then if there are 25 district regulations, they could waive 6 of them or something.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Yeah.
All right.
And it wouldn't be any less of a public process than an ordinance amendment. It would be the same level of public process.
And then it still goes to design review board. Mm-hmm. So what is the advantage of that?
The goal is that we wouldn't need so many ordinance amendments changing the code, because
So it wouldn't come to planning board? It could
No, it would
just-
still come, the waiver would come to the planning board, for the planning board's recommendation, and then go to the city commission. It would be the same process as an ordinance. They just wouldn't be amending the code. It would be specific to that development.
Oh, that's the waiver process you're talking about.
No, that concerns me. I mean, that really seems like spot zoning. So each property.
It's a special
Can
permit.
have-
It's not a, it's a
I
special.
know you could probably
yeah.
gonna word it differently, but it seems like, in essence, spot zoning, every property can have 25% of the zoning laws nullified. No, I don't like that.
Okay, I mean, it was a thought that we, it's certainly, it's up to your consideration. It's a thought that because a lot of times you get zoning amendments that you're told this is what we want to do, the code gets amended, and they do something, and they may propose something else, and the code was amended, so it's allowed.
Yeah, they still can amend the code, I guess.
They can still amend the code.
Just-
It's a different alternative where we get more certainty as to what's going to be
It's
built.
kind of work around spot zoning, because there's no zoning change, I guess, is what it is. But yeah, I agree, I mean, I see the point there.
The developers then become the de facto, urban planners. Yeah, I don't like that.
Well, I mean, it's the same process in ordinance, so if you wanted to increase the height, you just do it through an ordinance today, and that's why we have so many text amendments to our code. With no real guarantee and certainty that the project that they showed you is what's truly gonna be built.
Yeah, in a way, Gail, we'll have like a specific project to look at, I guess, that would be an advantage. But so there's no fewer steps in that process, just, yeah, it's interesting to think about,
It's a thought that we thought would be, a process we thought would be interesting to consider, given the amount of ordinance amendments we get every single month.
That's the real problem, that's,
And that's something,
Yeah.
that's something we can't stop.
I know.
That's, people have the right to ask to amend their zoning district. And so this would be an alternative where if we're gonna give you that amendment, we get a guarantee that this is exactly what we're gonna get.
I could see a benefit there, yeah.
Yeah.
I have two other questions. One, Maria, is about the understory. So basically, what you're doing is elevating the adjusted grade of the property to the base flood elevation. Is that what's happening?
Well, no. Basically, when we did a scenario where, for example, if you wanted to build an understory with the requirements that are already in the code right now. So the code says that the understory needs to be start at the future crown of the road.
Okay.
No lower than that. So, for example, we did like a scenario where the future crown of the road is 3.7 in AVD, let's say. So the minimum floor-to-ceiling height for the understory is 10 feet.
The max?
The minimum, right? It's the minimum right now we're establishing. It used to say 12, the code, and now we established that, Rogelio was mentioning that they get a lot of waivers for that requirement. So we lowered the minimum height of the understory to 10 feet. So that takes you to 13.7 NAVD. Now, if you look at BFE, for example, BFE of 8 in GVD is 7.44. 6.44 in NAVD.
Why are we doing NAVD?
Because now everything is going to move to NAVD. So we moved everything to NAVD.
Everything's moving to, really?
NAVD.
8 through 13 are gonna go away?
Well, I mean, we're mentioning both numbers in our code right now, but as we understand it, building codes are moving to NAVD.
Well, let's just keep the 8 through 13.
I like NGVD because the numbers are cleaner.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So that basically, when we did a scenario, it basically puts the maximum freeboard is 5. It places your first habitable level above the maximum freeboard of about 2.5 feet, above the maximum design flood elevation.
Let's just go NGVD, so.
Yeah.
Future crown of the road,
So future crown of a road would be, well, right now I only have an AVD. So it would be, let me
like
see.
5 and or 6 or something, right?
5.26.
5.26.
Right.
So 10
So
plus that
5.26
would
plus
be
10,
15.
15.
And
you're
13 is the
8,
max.
8 plus, so 13.
Yeah,
So you're about 2.5 feet above. And if you're limiting your height of the building measured from the maximum design flood elevation, you basically lose 2.5 feet or 3 feet when you build an understory. So we are allowing for, if you have a house with an understory, we are proposing to allow 3 additional feet of height, total height, to allow for the understory and for the upper floors to be, to have a decent floor to ceiling height.
Let me just ask a quick question. Sorry, Jose.
No.
It used to be that 7.5 was the max for the understory, and then anything above 7.5 required a waiver process or something? Yeah.
They required a
Thought you
DRB waiver at that point, is the
They
way?
had to fill in, there was like a max, because they didn't want it really. Sorry, Tom.
So the understories originally came about because of areas like palm and hibiscus, where the grade was so low in relation to a very high base flood elevation that homes were being built on these 8-foot mounds. And so the concept was, in those extreme situations, let's let that area be usable as a non-habitable space. That's how the understory was developed. Then conceptually, the determination was made that homes that don't have that extreme difference should also be allowed to do it. But I don't ever recall it being maxed at 7.5 feet. I recall it may have been 8 feet or 9 feet in order to make sure that people weren't abusing it. But what we've seen over time is that it's so advantageous that we want to be able to make sure that the fact that people are raising their yards will not penalize them. And we also want to make sure that it's a fairly decent area for usability. So I think a 10-foot minimum is good. To the extent they want to make it a little higher at the expense of their floor to ceiling heights above, they could certainly do that. This gives them that flexibility.
Okay. So at the moment, currently, the understory is a max of 12, or a minimum of 12. Why is there a minimum, not a maximum?
Do you recall what the, I don't have the code in front of me, but do you
It's
recall?
for residential multifamily. The only place where it's
multifamily.
mentioned,
Oh.
yes, but the only place where it's mentioned, that minimum is mentioned, is in the residential multifamily. But
Yeah, that's completely different than single
yeah.
family. The
I was
reason we
thinking
have
RS,
it
yeah.
as a minimum in multifamily is because we wanted to make sure that it was going to be able to accommodate a change in future sidewalk and street elevation. But that's different than single-family understory.
Yeah. So single-family understory, that's what I was
Single-family,
talking about, the 7.5 max.
That does not have I don't believe that has a current minimum
No.
at all.
No.
I don't believe so either.
Yeah.
No.
It's got a max, I guess.
Well, it's got a maximum that
thought-
would
I
be
thought-
predicated by the maximum height of the building as measured from base flood elevation
flood
plus freeboard.
Yeah, I remember a kind of contentious planning board meeting where we kind of made recommendations about understory amendments, and
One of the most contentious things about it at that time was that we had recommended at the time that understories not require DRB approval.
right.
And the commission felt differently. They felt it should continue to have DRB approval.
Isn't that beyond a certain height, like beyond 7.5 feet or something like that?
No, again, understories are going to be predicated upon what your base flood elevation plus freeboard is and what the maximum height of the home is. And there are some instances where you won't get much more than 8 or 9 feet of understory, depending upon what your base flood elevation plus freeboard is. There are other instances where you could potentially get more.
So at the moment, all understory goes to DRB and
Correct.
resident-
If you're proposing an understory in a single-family district, you have to go to the design review board.
And that's not changing as a result of this?
We are proposing for it to be allowed.
One of the things
I would agree with that.
One of the things the consultant recommended is perhaps we should re-explore this. We agreed. And so that is one of the things that we're proposing,
So
is
it's
that
really-
we remove mandatory DRB approval.
Yeah.
Now, DRB approval would still be required if somebody is proposing other waivers or seeking a variance.
Right.
And then if that included an understory, they'd have to go, but not solely because they're proposing an understory.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I think that would be a smart amendment to make. And the last question I had, we didn't really get into this at all, but I have had the experience often where the kind of, the right-of-way holds up projects because they're on county roads and like the driveway approach, for instance. Is there a way to consolidate the city and the county process when it comes to like, driveway approaches and right-of-way?
We're willing to take suggestions.
I mean, like, almost couldn't Miami Beach just adopt like the county standard so that when they're approving it, we kind of know it's going to be approved at the county level? Because I've had it like a decorative driveway approach through Public Works that they say get the county approval first, and it's 6 months before that happens, before they'll look at it.
My understanding is that in most instances, the Public Works Department can approve those pretty quickly unless there's a unique set of
I
circumstances.
think some roads are county roads to this.
Well, all roads are regulated by the county. The county has jurisdiction over all roadways that are non-state roadways. But my understanding is that as long as it meets certain county standards, the Public Works Department can approve it. I know I did a driveway approach in my home in the Gables about 7 years ago, and it only required city approval. And basically, as long as I met the standards set forth by the city, they said, we can go ahead and approve this. There's a lot of things that you have to do in terms of showing insurance, and you've got to sign indemnification and all these other things. But there's always going to be those very unique sets of circumstances where somebody might want a driveway approach that's wider. Somebody might want a driveway approach that's closer to a corner than would otherwise be permitted because of a unique set of circumstances. Those are tough to get around.
Yeah,
but
that
they
you can't
typically
do.
won't hold up a building permit for a home.
I'm going to submit my home as a case study because we replaced our driveway. We submitted and we poured the driveway in our property. 4 months later, we poured the driveway approach because we were just waiting on county approval for the approach, and it was standard. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, that's something where we can't put that in land development regulations because that's right-of-way. If there are issues with regard to driveway approaches that are facing property owners citywide, perhaps that's something that could be addressed as a separate issue. But in our land development regulations, we can't put in regulations regarding driveway approaches because it's public right-of-way.
There was, I guess the question is, there was something like the city said, we can't review this till county first approves it, and then we'll approve it. And so
Unless there's a special set of circumstances, I'm not aware of that, but we can always reach out to the Public Works Department, find out from them what the actual process is, and then we can always try to address that separately. The board could certainly make recommendations in that regard.
Okay. I know it's a targeted item, but
Okay.
my wife was cursing me for months. Again, I think it's kind of a crazy experience doing this. I feel any one of these items, we would spend an hour debating on a normal board meeting. So, I really like the initiative and the effort, and I think it benefits the code tremendously.
Thank you. Any other comments from? No? Okay.
No, I think I think the clarification and the transparency is such an upgrade. Because, yeah, it's a maze to try to go through these codes sometimes, especially for lay people. And, I'm assuming a lot of it's developer reading it as well, too, and I'm sure that they're going to appreciate it as well, since the homeowner or whoever is constructing or developing something is looking to them for their guidance, so.
The only people we don't anticipate embracing these are zoning attorneys,
Right.
because we've taken some business away from them.
Yeah.
But really, we, again, not only as the new code writers, but as an architect working in the city, I can tell you, we would really benefit from something that would be simpler. And last time, we gave a presentation with a company that the city has engaged, Gridix, which I think it's fascinating, in which you can be able to look at these things in an interactive way. You can go to your property, find out the information on your property. So beyond all the wonderful things that Maria explained today, there will be even a more user-friendly tool that would make it accessible to, even a person that's technologically challenged like me to actually be able to use it.
Yeah, I was trying to remember, GridX is going to show you what your zoning law is for your property or what your conditional use. But what is it again? It shows what exactly, GridX?
So you'll be able to click your property, kind of, I don't know if you've been to the Miami-Dade Property Appraiser's website where you click a property and it tells you your tax information and all that stuff. So this will tell you your zoning information. It'll give you, it's actually linked in with the property appraiser, so it will show you some of that information. But then it'll give you code sections where it'll tell you what zoning district you're in, and you'll be able to click that, and it'll take you right to the code section that's applicable to your property, so you can see what's there.
And vice versa, the same. I think I showed a slide when you're on the text and you see, a specific location, in text form, you'll be able to click on that and view it on a map. So it's an interactive way of tool that will help a lot.
There are already several cities that use that software as opposed to MuniCode. The other benefit is that when we do code amendments, today we use MuniCode, and it may take several months before a code amendment is reflected on MuniCode. We will be updating it in-house once we can switch to the GridX platform. We tried to put our current code on there, but because of the varying numbering structures that our current code has, it just was not working with their system. It didn't synchronize well. So with this, it'll be a clean code. Everything will have the same standards. It'll be much easier to integrate it into GridX, and you'll be able to see exactly what you can do with your property. And there are other cities that use it in Dade County. I think North Miami, City of Miami. I think City of Hollywood in Broward County uses it. There are several that are using it already, and they're expanding outside of the state now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was great.
It's funny, by coincidence, last night I got an article sent to me, and it talked about cities that are going to disappear with sea level rise. And a lot of them are, believe it or not, in India, Pakistan, but they said in the U.S., New York clearly is the biggest at risk, and every article's about Miami Beach.
Yeah.
We don't have submerged subway tunnels at least,
I mean, it was really horrible.
New York, we had the planning conference.